Hello and welcome to Daily Dose Radio, a 5-minute-a-day podcast studying the Psalms verse by verse, recorded here in the dining room of the Bible Bistro, located in Sharonville, Ohio. Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Daily Dose Radio here in the Bible Bistro. Now, yesterday we were looking at what I called Manasseh's story. It begins there in verse 10. Such as sit in darkness. That begins this second little parable story that the psalmist is using to get across his main point, which he's going to take some time to get there, but he wants to build and layer on all this information and all this teaching so that when he gets to his point, it can just explode on the scene. And he's sort of given us by dribs and drabs a little of that same theology all the way through until we get to the end. And then in the end, it's going to be very satisfying when he makes his statement. But as I said, we have Manasseh's story here in part. I relate it to Manasseh's story, what we have here. Those sitting in darkness, those who are afflicted and in irons, and they're there because, in verse 11, they've rebelled. They rebelled against the words of God and condemned the counsel of the Most High. Now, Manasseh's story, I went back and looked, in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, in verse 11, we have him carried away by the princes of Assyria to Babylon. And then he's put into prison there. But then, in verse 12 of chapter 33 in 2 Chronicles, he cries out to the Lord. And that's where we start today, here in verse 13. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them out of their distresses. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and brake their bands asunder. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness, and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So Manasseh is a great example of this happening. Not that the psalmist actually has him in mind here, but I say just it's a great example because he's placed in prison because he rebelled against the words of God. But then when he's there, he knew enough, because he had a godly father. He had Hezekiah as his father, and so he knew. He knew better, and he knew the remedy. And so when he's in prison, under the shadow of death, he cries out to the Lord. And you know what happens? Well, the Lord delivers him. But here in verse 13, we have just that. He cried unto the Lord in their trouble. He saved them out of their distresses. Exactly the same as was said in verse 6. So in Manasseh's story, in verse 12, he cries out to the Lord, and then in verse 13, the Lord delivers him. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and brake their bands in sunder. So the Lord did that for Manasseh, and he does it for everyone who calls out in that situation. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness, for his wonderful works to the children of men. So here it is again. So we have it here in 15, we had it in verse 8, and we're going to see it again in verse 21 this week. And then next week, we'll have it in verse 31. So he continues to repeat the same thing. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness. So we've seen the Lord's goodness as it relates to the saints, and we've seen the Lord's goodness now as it relates to those who are in prison. They're in prison because they rebelled against the Lord. And even though they rebelled against the Lord, yet the Lord is good. And because of his goodness and mercy, when they cried, he heard and delivered. And it's just exactly what he will do for every one of us. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness. Friend, it doesn't matter how dark it might seem right now. If you'll call out to the Lord, he will deliver you from your distress. Christian friend, that especially means you. Unsaved friend, that especially means you too. Because for you, the Lord's goodness extends to your salvation, to the saving of your dark and dead soul. And Christian friend, it means for you, for the glory of his name, to deliver you and bring you to that city of habitation. So let's call out to the Lord today while we can still call it today. Join me again tomorrow, and we'll look at verses 17 through 21 here on Daily Dose Radio. Thanks for listening to Daily Dose Radio. For more fresh and delicious Bible studies, podcasts, books, and more, Check out the Bible Bistro online and on YouTube. Join me again next time for Daily Dose Radio.